A flight attendant tried to humiliate a black man's family mid-flight, unaware his uncle was the Army commander, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He wrapped his hands around a child's throat, silencing his cries until he went limp. Subscribe if you believe no cruelty against the innocent should ever be ignored. The moment the beverage cart rattled past row 14, a sudden, sharp sound sliced through the soft murmur of the cabin, a drink tray slamming down too hard, plastic clinking violently against metal. The jolt startled Malik Rivers, who had been reaching down to retrieve a comic book from under the seat. His shoulder accidentally brushed against the seat in front, but before he could sit upright, he felt it. A pair of eyes on him. Cold, unblinking, judgmental. Grant Vaynar stood a few feet away, adjusting his tie with one hand, his other still hovering over the cart. His lips were pressed in a thin, annoyed line, and his brows furrowed just enough to betray irritation beneath his composed exterior. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The stare itself struck Malik like a silent reprimand. Malik quickly looked away, sinking into his seat beside his father, Thomas Rivers. The older man was mid-conversation with a fellow passenger across the aisle, speaking in that calm, patient tone he always used, even when the world felt tense. A history teacher by trade and temperament, Thomas rarely raised his voice, but Malik didn't interrupt. He didn't want to bother his dad about something so small. As the cabin resumed its gentle hum, the overhead lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the long-haul nighttime routine. Passengers were adjusting neck pillows, watching movies, or drifting to sleep. But not Malik. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. A few rows behind, partially concealed by a tall businessman leaning into the aisle, sat a man in his early 50s, his posture rigid, his eyes observant beneath a pair of modest reading glasses. General Adrian Holt looked like just another traveler, a civilian with a plain gray jacket, a dog-eared military novel open in his lap. But his gaze hadn't left the aisle since the tray incident. He had seen the stare, the way the attendant's eyes lingered, the way the boy stiffened. Adrian turned a page in his book without reading a word. A few minutes passed. Malik reached again under the seat, fumbling for his earbuds this time. Again, he brushed the seat in front, just barely. Again, the same burning presence returned. He didn't even have to look to know it was Grant. The flight attendant stood frozen, holding a bottle of ginger ale, his jaw tight. His voice came low and clipped as he addressed a nearby passenger, but Malik could feel the energy shift. Tension hung like static. He tried to pretend nothing had happened, plugging in his earbuds and turning up the volume. Still, he couldn't help glancing back. Adrian's gaze hadn't faltered. He took in everything. The stiffness in Grant's shoulders, the careful control in his movements, and most of all, the direction of his attention. Adrian's instincts, honed from decades of military service, stirred quietly beneath his calm surface. Something wasn't right. Not yet explosive, but wrong. Thomas finally noticed his son's unease. "You okay, buddy?" he asked gently, leaning toward Malik. Malik hesitated. "Yeah, I think so. Just tired." But Thomas saw the hesitation. He turned slightly in his seat, glancing up at the cabin crew moving about. Grant was already gone, wheeling the cart further down the aisle with brisk efficiency. Thomas decided not to press, but the knot in his chest remained. Time stretched. Darkness deepened outside the windows, swallowing the last traces of sunset. The cabin lights dimmed further, leaving only reading lights and screens glowing like fireflies in the night. Malik rested his head on his father's shoulder, finally beginning to doze off. His breathing slowed, his fingers loosening around the edges of the seatbelt. Thomas reached for the airline blanket, carefully tucking it around his son. His eyes lingered on the boy's peaceful face, then swept the cabin. Most passengers were lost in their own worlds: sleep, screens, silence. Adrian closed his book, resting it on his knee, his gaze drifting again toward the front of the cabin. He noted the absence of Grant. Not in the galley, not near the jump seat. The man had vanished from view, but Adrian's instinct told him this wasn't over. He knew how quiet threats worked, how they waited for shadows and silence to make their move. A few rows up, Grant stood behind a curtain, watching through a narrow slit. His expression was blank now, unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on row 14. Passengers laughed softly at a rom-com playing a few rows back. The clink of ice in cups punctuated the air. A baby cried briefly before settling. All ordinary sounds of a long flight, and yet, somewhere beneath it all, the storm continued to stir. Adrian adjusted his seatbelt and glanced at the call button overhead. He didn't press it. He didn't move. He just waited, watchful, silent, still. Because somewhere in that silence, something was growing. Something Malik couldn't yet name. Something his father was beginning to fear. Something his uncle already understood. The storm often brews behind the calmest clouds. The tray slammed down with a sharp crack, loud enough to startle several nearby passengers. Malik jerked awake, blinking rapidly as the water in the cup trembled, nearly spilling onto the folded napkin beneath it. Thomas's head snapped up, eyes narrowing at the retreating figure of the flight attendant. Grant Vaynar didn't look back as he strode down the aisle, but a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a silent satisfaction in the disruption he'd caused. Thomas glanced at his son, placing a calming hand on the boy's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Malik nodded slowly, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Yeah, just surprised me," he murmured. But the tension in his frame didn't ease. Something about the way Grant had slammed the tray down, so forcefully, so deliberate, made it hard to chalk up to an accident. From a few rows back, General Adrian Holt watched the exchange with subtle intensity. His book remained open on his lap, but his eyes were no longer scanning its pages. Instead, they tracked Grant's movements, noting the stiffness in his shoulders, the deliberate sharpness in his stride. Adrian had spent his life reading men in battlefield situations, aggression, control, instability. This wasn't just a tired attendant having a bad day. This was something deeper, something calculated. Earlier, Adrian had noticed the same man glaring when Malik had accidentally bumped the back of a seat while climbing out to use the restroom. The boy had apologized instantly, as any well-raised teenager would, but Grant's glare hadn't softened. If anything, it had sharpened with a flicker of something more sinister, contempt. When Thomas later asked for an extra glass of water, the tone of Grant's response had been clipped, bordering on disrespectful. "Fine," he'd muttered without looking at Thomas directly, placing the cup down with a hollow thud that spoke volumes. Malik had caught the strange tone, too, but he had said nothing. He didn't want to make a big deal out of something small. His dad had taught him the value of keeping calm, of not stirring the pot unless it boiled over. Still, there was a tight knot forming in his stomach, a quiet discomfort that wouldn't go away. Thomas, meanwhile, sat back in his seat, his fingers tapping slowly against the plastic armrest. He wasn't a man prone to suspicion, but something about the attendant's behavior bothered him. There was a deliberate edge to it, not random or clumsy, but almost personal. He glanced down at Malik, who had pulled his hood up and leaned his head back against the seat, trying to rest again. Thomas offered a reassuring pat, though the concern in his eyes lingered. "Keep your eyes closed," Thomas said softly. "Just relax, kiddo." It's a long flight behind them. Adrian shifted in his seat. The soft thrum of the engines filled the silence, but the earlier cheerfulness in the cabin had subtly dimmed. The businessman across the aisle returned to typing on his laptop. A student resumed scrolling on his tablet. Children who had once been giggling now played more quietly. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier, not chaotic, not loud, but tense in a way that only a few could feel. Adrian's gaze returned to Grant, who was now checking the overhead compartments. The attendant's hands moved efficiently, but his eyes kept flickering toward Malik's row. Adrian noted the glances, the slow, almost deliberate way Grant moved past their seats, as if marking them. He filed every movement away, mentally cataloging patterns like he would on a mission. He leaned back and turned a page in his book, pretending to read. His lips pressed into a thin line. Patience, he reminded himself. Patience reveals what force sometimes distorts. A few minutes passed. The soft ding of a seatbelt sign turned off, and a few passengers unbuckled to stretch or head toward the lavatory. Malik, now fully awake, reached for his headphones. As he bent forward, his eyes met Grant's, who was making his way back up the aisle. There was no smile, just a cold, assessing stare that lasted a second too long. Malik looked away quickly. Thomas noticed. "What was that?" he asked, voice low. "I don't know," Malik replied. "He just keeps staring." "It's weird," Thomas exhaled slowly. He didn't want to escalate anything, not without reason, but he made a mental note to report the man's behavior if things continued. Further down the aisle, Adrian closed his book. The intercom crackled with the captain's voice, informing passengers of mild turbulence ahead. Seatbelt signs lit up again. Grant passed through the cabin, checking for compliance. When he reached Malik's row, he paused. "Seatbelt on," he said sharply. Malik looked down, puzzled. "It is on." Grant narrowed his eyes. "Tighten it." Thomas frowned. "He's secured." We checked. Grant didn't respond. He stared for another heartbeat, then moved on, the tone of his shoes against the floor sharper than before. Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his seat tray. The moments stretched. The turbulence passed, barely noticeable. But Grant didn't return to the galley. Instead, he lingered near the front, occasionally glancing back. There was a hum building in the air, a dissonance that only a few could sense but none could name. Malik tugged his blanket closer. Why is he so angry? Thomas had no answer. He just reached over and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. Behind them, Adrian slowly turned his head toward the aisle once more. His instincts whispered warnings louder now. He didn't know what Grant was planning, but he knew one thing for certain. Sometimes, venom waits for the perfect moment to strike. The snap came so fast, so loud, it sliced through the cabin's low hum like glass shattering. "I asked if I could have juice instead," Malik said softly, holding the untouched soda can in both hands. His voice was polite, tentative even, the way most 14-year-olds spoke to adults they didn't know. Grant Vaynar's reaction was immediate and jarring. The flight attendant's face twisted, his mouth curling into a sneer as he leaned forward over the meal tray. "You think you deserve special treatment?" he hissed, his voice loud enough to draw attention from passengers nearby. Without waiting for a response, Grant's hand shot out and grabbed the front of Malik's collar, yanking the boy upward with startling force. The tray clattered, the soda can fell and rolled beneath the seat, and Malik's wide eyes met his attackers, shocked, confused, terrified. "Hey, let go of him!" Thomas Rivers shouted, already half out of his seat. But before he could get a hand on Grant, the attendant's grip shifted from collar to throat. Gasps erupted all around them. Grant's fingers closed tightly around Malik's neck. The boy's back arched instinctively, his hands flying up to claw at the man's wrists. The narrow aisle turned into a stage of horror. Passengers turned, stunned, many frozen in place, unsure if what they were witnessing was real. Malik's legs kicked under the table, his sneakers scraping the floor in frantic protest. His mouth opened, but only a choking sound came out. His fingers scratched helplessly at Grant's forearms, his movements weakening with every passing second. Thomas lunged. "Stop! That's my son! Let go!" His hands grabbed for Grant's arm, but the larger man shoved him backward with a violent jerk of his shoulder. Thomas stumbled, hitting the side of the seat with a grunt, his glasses slipping down his nose. Grant's face was twisted with something close to rage. His eyes didn't blink, didn't shift. They were locked on Malik's face, as if punishing him for something only he understood. A second later, a water cup fell to the floor. A woman screamed, but no one moved forward. Authority paralyzed them. The flight attendant's uniform, the official voice earlier over the intercom, all of it lent Grant a dangerous illusion of control, and the crowd didn't know how to break it. Malik's body started to slump. Just 3 rows behind, Adrian Holt slowly placed his book face down on the tray in front of him. The pages fluttered slightly, disturbed by the shifting air. He stood, not rushed, not panicked, but with the precise calmness of a man who had learned long ago that acting too soon could cost lives. His boots, though civilian in appearance, made a quiet thud with every step as he began walking down the aisle. Malik's face had turned pale. His eyes were rolling back. The grip around his throat hadn't loosened. The veins in his neck bulged as his body twisted with less and less force. Thomas, still on the floor, reached out again, screaming for help, for anyone to stop this madness. His voice cracked with desperation. "He can't breathe! Somebody, please!" But no one moved. Grant held all the power in that moment, and fear had silenced the cabin. Only one man kept moving forward. Adrian's pulse was steady, his mind sharp. Every step he took was fueled not just by anger, but by calculation. He was gauging the space between him and the target, estimating the angle of approach, measuring the force he'd need to apply if escalation became necessary. He could still hear Malik's faint, choking gasps. They triggered something deep inside him. Not rage, but resolve. The kind of silent, buried determination that only comes from battlefields and funerals. He was now 1 row away. No one had recognized him yet. No one knew who he was. To them, he was just a tall man in a plain shirt with sharp eyes and an unusually still face. But to Grant, Adrian was invisible. Still hunched over Malik, Grant gritted his teeth, eyes narrowed as though the boy had personally insulted him. "Little brat," he muttered under his breath, tightening his grip for a final time. Malik's hands dropped to his lap. And that was when Adrian paused, just 1 moment, before the storm inside him broke open. His stance shifted, his shoulders square, hands relaxed at his sides, fingers half-curled in a soldier's reflex. A few passengers saw him then. They felt something change, though they couldn't explain what. Maybe it was in his walk, maybe it was in his silence, or maybe it was something else, something unspoken but powerful. They felt it. Malik's head tilted, his lips slightly parted, no air left in his lungs. Thomas screamed again, this time hoarse, broken. "Malik!" And in that moment, Adrian took the final step forward. No words. Not yet. Just his presence. The aisle seemed narrower than before, the air heavier, and Grant, finally sensing the movement behind him, turned his head slightly. But not enough to see who was coming. Not enough to understand what was about to happen. Not yet. But something shifted in his posture, just enough to loosen his grip. Just enough to make Malik's limp form sag back into the seat, his lips blue, his breaths shallow, his consciousness slipping. And Adrian stopped just inches behind him. Waiting, watching, calculating, because the line had been crossed, and Adrian Holt had just stepped onto the battlefield. The line between order and chaos can be crossed in a single breath. His small frame sagged forward as Grant's fingers finally loosened from around his throat. His body dropped with a soft thud against the seat, head rolling limply to the side, lips parted, eyes fluttering shut. The color drained from his face in seconds. Thomas's scream tore through the stunned silence. "Malik!" His hands flew to his son, shaking his shoulders gently at first, then more frantically. "Malik! Breathe, son. Please, come on." His voice cracked, high and strangled, panic overwhelming him. His fingers pressed against the boy's neck, searching desperately for a pulse, but his hands trembled too hard to tell. Several passengers gasped, rising halfway from their seats, frozen in helpless horror. A teenage boy across the aisle stood, unsure whether to move or sit. An older man reached for the call button, jabbing it repeatedly. Still others just watched, wide-eyed and paralyzed. And yet Grant, the man who had done this, showed no remorse. Standing above them, he was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling as though exhilarated. His jaw twitched with tension, but his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, held a flicker of grim satisfaction. "Sit down," Grant barked, turning to the passengers with the practiced dominance of someone who had gotten away with this kind of behavior before. "Everyone stay in your seats unless you want to be detained upon landing." The sharpness in his voice stunned the crowd. The uniform, the badge, the flight attendant title, they lent him a thin veneer of authority that still, somehow, confused the frightened onlookers. A crackle from the intercom split the air. "This is your captain." Everyone remain calm and seated. "We are aware of the situation in the cabin and are assessing next steps. I repeat, remain calm." But calm was already dead on Flight 927. Thomas was sobbing now, muttering prayers, alternating between pressing Malik's chest and patting his cheek. "Stay with me? Please, just stay with me." And that's when Adrian Holt stood up. Not quickly, not angrily, not with the loud force of a man seeking attention. He rose with a stillness that spoke volumes. A quiet, dangerous stillness that made the air feel colder. He stepped into the aisle. Grant turned, catching the movement out of the corner of his eye. His lips curled upward into a mocking grin, the kind worn by someone who believed he still held control. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, sarcasm dripping off every word like oil. "Because if you want to start shouting too, I'll be happy to. You just put your hands on my nephew." The words landed soft, but sharp, almost too quiet to be heard, and yet every syllable froze the air. Grant blinked, not quite processing it yet. "What?" Adrian took one more step, his frame casting a long shadow across the aisle. He wasn't in uniform, just dark jeans and a plain black shirt, but something about the way he carried himself shifted the atmosphere completely. Even passengers who had no idea who he was sat back, breath held. Grant let out a short, barking laugh. "Oh, so you're the uncle. Cute. What are you going to do? File a complaint? Go viral on the internet?" He smirked. "You don't look like much." Adrian didn't answer. His eyes didn't blink. Behind them, Thomas looked up, his eyes red and full of grief and fear, one hand still resting on Malik's unmoving chest. The other passengers didn't move. No one dared. "You have no idea who you've just challenged," Adrian said finally, and this time his voice had steel beneath it. A low hum, not loud, but it cut deeper than any shout could. And suddenly, the illusion of control that Grant clung to began to crack. The attendant faltered, his smirk twitching, his mouth slightly open as if to respond, but no words came. He couldn't look away. He didn't know why his knees felt weaker. He didn't understand why the man before him, no uniform, no badge, no title, somehow made the air feel heavier. But everyone else in that cabin did. They felt it too. A shift, a turning of the tide, and deep in Adrian's chest, past the layers of discipline and years of command, something cold and ancient stirred. Not rage, but resolve. Malik's face flashed in his memory. Bright, young, breathless, now unconscious. And Grant, panting like a wolf that thought it had bitten the sheep, but had missed the lion. Adrian didn't blink. "You have no idea who you've just challenged." Grant laughed, a loud, mocking sound that cut through the tense silence of the cabin like a blade. "What are you going to do? Shout at me?" he sneered, the edges of his grin sharp with arrogance. His hand shot out, pressing flat against Adrian's chest in a gesture meant to intimidate, not harm. The push was slight, almost theatrical, but it was enough to draw gasps from nearby passengers. The tension that had been simmering just beneath the surface now snapped taut. Adrian didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He stood tall, unwavering, His eyes locked on Grant's with a stillness that carried weight, more than strength, more than authority. It was the calm of a man who had seen far worse and lived through fire to tell the tale. Around them, the hum of the plane's engines faded into background noise. The only sounds now were the soft cries of frightened passengers, the rustle of shifting bodies, and the distant, desperate gasps of Malik's still unconscious form. Phones rose into the air. The glow of screens blinked to life as passengers, unsure of what would happen next, began recording. Some leaned away in fear, others leaned closer in curiosity. A few clutched armrests, eyes wide, whispering prayers or curses under their breath. Thomas hovered beside his son, torn between tending to Malik's fragile body and stopping his brother from doing something that could bring even more chaos. His hands trembled, pressing against Malik's chest to feel for breath. It was there, faint but steady. Relief flickered in his eyes, but it was fleeting. He turned, eyes locking with Adrian's, silently pleading for restraint. Adrian saw the plea but didn't respond. His eyes never left Grant. For a moment, time stretched, expanding like the thin silence before a storm. Adrian's training surged forward in his mind, not just military tactics, but emotional discipline, psychological reads. Grant's breathing was shallow and quick. The flush on his cheeks betrayed the adrenaline he couldn't control. He was impulsive, reckless, predictable. Adrian waited one beat, then another, and then, like a coiled spring snapping into motion, Adrian struck. With precision honed by years of field combat, he grabbed Grant's wrist midair as the attendant raised his hand again, perhaps to push, perhaps to strike. It didn't matter. Adrian's fingers closed tight, twisting sharply. The snap was not enough to break bone, but it sent bolts of pain shooting up Grant's arm. Grant screamed, a high-pitched yelp that shattered his earlier bravado. The passengers gasped again. Some stood halfway from their seats. One man dropped his phone. A woman whispered, "Did you see that?" Grant collapsed to one knee, his face contorted in pain, his free hand scrambling to pry Adrian's grip loose. Adrian stepped forward, leaning in close until their faces were inches apart. His voice, low and razor-sharp, sliced through the air with terrifying clarity. "I'm not just his uncle," Adrian said, his tone calm, almost surgical. "I am General Adrian Holt, commander of the 4th Division." A collective murmur rippled through the cabin. The title struck like thunder. Adrian's face remained unreadable, but his grip did not loosen. "And you've just declared war on the wrong family." The words landed with finality. Passengers who had once hesitated now whispered his name with awe. A father near the aisle pulled his child closer. The air seemed to shift around Adrian, as though the truth had weight, and now everyone could feel it. Grant, stunned, blinked up at him, not in recognition of defeat, but in the slow dawning of fear. Because for the first time, he realized he had underestimated the wrong man. And now, there would be no hiding behind a uniform or a badge. Around them, the scene hung in the air like a painting. Grant on his knees, trembling in pain and humiliation. Adrian, standing tall, composed, a guardian awakened. The dramatic irony that had lived quietly until now erupted into full force. What Grant thought was just another passenger had, in fact, been the worst possible opponent. Somewhere behind them, Malik stirred faintly, a weak cough breaking the silence. It was the sound of fragile life clinging on, a sound that reminded everyone why this confrontation mattered. Thomas, tears glistening in his eyes, nodded once toward Adrian. It was a gesture of thanks, of trust, of unspoken brotherhood. Adrian finally released Grant's wrist, letting the man slump further to the floor, defeated. Gasps ripple through the crowd as realization dawns. The truth revealed can silence even the loudest arrogance. Grant dropped to his knees with a sharp cry, clutching his twisted wrist in agony. The snap of bone or tendon, no one could tell, echoed louder than the murmur of the engines. A gasp swept through the cabin like a gust of wind breaking through still air. Adrian Holt stood over him, his posture unshaken, boots firmly planted in the narrow aisle, his frame casting a long shadow across the crouched attendant. He didn't move, didn't blink. His fingers relaxed only slightly after releasing the joint lock, but his expression held steady, controlled, unreadable. Passengers sat frozen, stunned not just by the swiftness of Adrian's move, but by the transformation. The quiet, observant man from row 18 now stood like a commander in battle, a presence that silenced the room without shouting. A few seats away, Thomas Rivers leaned over his son's motionless body, panic etched deep into his features. His ear pressed tightly against Malik's chest, searching, praying. Then a whisper of relief passed through his lips. There it was, a heartbeat, faint, fragile, but there, still alive. "He's breathing," Thomas said breathlessly to no one and everyone at once, his voice quivering as he gently adjusted Malik's head and wiped a cold bead of sweat from his son's brow. Adrian's hand shot up with calm authority. "Oxygen!" Now his tone wasn't loud, but it pierced the air like a command barked across a battlefield. Instinctively, a man in a medical badge, a passenger from 2 rows back, scrambled forward. "I'm a nurse," the man said, sliding into the row with a small travel med kit in hand. "I've got him." Adrian nodded once, stepping aside without breaking eye contact with Grant, who still knelt like a deflated threat. The tension in the air didn't ease. If anything, it deepened, thickened, waiting for the next spark. Grant, red-faced and humiliated, hissed through clenched teeth. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "I'll have security waiting for you when we land." Adrian finally moved, not in fear, but in something far colder. He took one deliberate step forward, kneeling slightly so that his face was just inches from Grant's. His eyes, sharp as steel, didn't blink. "Do you really think civilian security frightens me?" Adrian's words cut through the air like glass, low but unshakably firm. The cabin, though hushed, felt ready to explode. The illusion that Grant had any power left was visibly crumbling. His chest heaved, not just from the pain, but from the realization that something had shifted, and it couldn't be undone. From the far end of the plane, a child whimpered. A man cleared his throat nervously. The nurse attending Malik called out for someone to grab an oxygen mask from the overhead panel. Hands moved quicker now, passengers obeying. Not out of panic, but because they understood something crucial. There was a new leader on board. Adrian rose back to his full height, and only then did a few passengers begin to whisper to each other. The man who had so swiftly dropped Grant wasn't just another strong-willed traveler. There was training in every movement, control in every word, and a cold precision that didn't belong to anyone who feared consequences. Grant looked up, his pride shattered but his tongue still sharp. "This won't end well for you. I've got the Union. I've got connections." "You had power," Adrian interrupted, not raising his voice but freezing every other sound in the cabin. "You abused it. You lost it. Now sit down and be quiet." Grant opened his mouth again but said nothing. The look in Adrian's eyes wasn't rage, it was something more dangerous. Resolve. The nurse continued tending to Malik, calling out pulse checks and oxygen flow rates like he was in an ER. "He's coming around slowly," the man reported, glancing up. "He'll need a hospital when we land. But he's stable for now." Thomas gave a trembling nod of thanks, his hand never leaving Malik's. Near the front of the cabin, a passenger quietly lifted a phone, recording. Others began doing the same, not out of fear now, but to bear witness, to make sure this moment, the one where power changed hands, was not erased. Adrian didn't address the cameras. He didn't need to. His focus was clear. His stance never shifted. Grant slumped sideways, muttering to himself and avoiding every eye in the cabin. His authority had vanished. The fear he once controlled had turned against him. And still, Adrian stood, watching, waiting, because he knew this wasn't over. A man like Grant didn't rise to this level of cruelty alone. And somewhere, in this very aircraft, others might still be watching, waiting to reclaim the power that had just been stripped away. But Adrian was ready. He always had been. And as he turned ever so slightly to scan the rows, eyes sharp, posture steady, the passengers understood what had just walked into their midst. Strength doesn't always roar. It waits, and when it rises, it is undeniable. Oxygen hissed softly into the mask fitted over Malik's face, the sound a small comfort amid the rising chaos. His chest moved with shallow but rhythmic breaths. Thomas knelt beside him, trembling hands holding his son's limp arm, his voice caught somewhere between prayer and panic. His eyes darted toward Adrian, silently begging for strength, guidance, anything to keep him from falling apart. Adrian stood tall in the narrow aisle, commanding with the precision of a man who'd faced life-or-death decisions before. The cabin buzzed with unease, but his voice was calm and authoritative. Yes, you in 17C, help move that bag from under the seat so he can stretch out. Keep the air clear, he instructed, pointing with sharp certainty. And you, in the blue shirt, start recording, every second. Make sure the camera doesn't shake. We'll need it. The passengers moved without question now. Fear had begun to shift into obedience, and with obedience came the first flickers of hope. A young man with medical training crouched beside Malik, checking his pulse with professional urgency. He looked up and nodded once toward Adrian. It's weak, but it's there. He needs a hospital. Fast. The captain's voice crackled through the overhead speakers. This is Captain Renner from the flight deck. We're getting reports of a medical emergency and a disruption in the cabin. Can someone explain what's going on? Adrian stepped toward the nearest intercom. This is General Adrian Holt. My nephew has been assaulted by a member of your crew. I'm requesting an immediate diversion to the nearest medical facility. He won't survive another hour like this. The line went silent. A pause, thick with tension, stretched through the cabin. Suddenly, a harsh voice shattered the fragile calm. No diversion! Grant's voice rose above the quiet, his face twisted with rage. His eyes, bloodshot and erratic, darted across the passengers. He's faking it! This is a setup! That man's lying! Before anyone could react, Grant lunged at Adrian. His steps were frantic, his hands curled into fists. But Adrian, anticipating the move, sidestepped and locked an arm around Grant's, twisting it just enough to bring him to a halt. Stand down, Adrian growled, his voice low, dangerous. Grant panted heavily, but his eyes held defiance, not fear. Then came the moment no one expected. From across the galley, another figure stepped forward, quiet, cautious, yet deliberate. Lionel, the second flight attendant, a wiry man with a clipped beard and nervous hands, had remained nearly invisible until now. Passengers had barely registered him during the chaos, assuming he was just another shaken staff member. But now he stood firmly between Adrian and the captain's intercom. He's right, Lionel said, his voice trembling but steady enough to command attention. You don't know what you're interfering with. The words dropped like a stone in still water. The cabin froze. Thomas's head snapped up from Malik's side. The medical volunteer stopped mid-check. Passengers glanced at one another in confusion and dread. Adrian's eyes narrowed. What did you just say? Lionel's gaze darted toward Grant, then back to Adrian. You're making a mistake. You think this is just about an attack on a kid? You don't see the bigger picture. You've walked into something you don't understand. Adrian took a step forward, but Lionel didn't flinch. Grant, still gripping his injured wrist, smirked. They think they're heroes, Grant muttered under his breath. But they're just pawns. Speak plainly, Adrian demanded, his jaw clenched. What exactly am I interfering with? Lionel didn't answer right away. His breathing grew heavier, as if caught between fear and duty. Then, almost too quietly, he said, "You weren't supposed to notice." "No one ever does." The cryptic reply sent a chill through the air. The passengers began murmuring, fear creeping back into their voices. Some reached for their phones, others looked toward the emergency exits. One man whispered to his wife, "What is this? A hijacking?" Adrian kept his eyes locked on Lionel. "Then you've confirmed it," he said softly. "This wasn't just one man's rage. This was planned." Grant's smirk widened even as sweat trickled down his temple. "You're sharp, General." But not sharp enough. A voice from the back, a teenage boy with a cracked voice, called out, "Is my family safe?" "What's going on?" The question, raw and innocent, hung in the air like a warning bell. People were afraid. They needed a leader. Adrian turned, his voice rising so all could hear. "Everyone remain seated and calm. This situation is under control. If anyone else on this crew wants to reveal their allegiance, now is your chance." No one moved. The silence returned, this time heavier, more dangerous. Thomas gripped Malik's hand tighter, his voice barely a whisper. "How far does this go?" Adrian didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. The intercom came alive again. "Flight 927, this is Dominion Airfield Tower. We are ready to receive your emergency landing. You are cleared to descend." Adrian gave a short nod toward the speakers, then glanced at the subdued crowd. He could feel it building, the tension, the unseen threat, the sense that more lurked beneath the surface. But for now, he had regained control. Then, with a final glance toward Lionel, he spoke with cold precision. "Sometimes enemies wear the same uniform as friends." The black boy lay unconscious, his father screaming for help, while the flight attendant sneered, thinking no one on board would dare challenge him. If you believe every act of brutality must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. You don't know what you're interfering with. Lionel's voice rang through the tense cabin, low and uneven but laced with something chilling, conviction. The passengers, still shaken from the violent assault on Malik, turned their attention from the unconscious boy and his furious father to the second attendant who had, until now, remained eerily quiet. Adrian Holt, standing firm near the center aisle, narrowed his eyes at Lionel. The general didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle. He studied the man's face, not for fear, but for calculation. Lionel wasn't panicked or uncertain like someone caught off guard. No, his expression was disturbingly calm, as if he'd just revealed a well-rehearsed truth that had waited patiently for the right moment. "I said," Lionel continued, stepping forward as Grant whimpered behind him on the floor, "you don't understand what this is. We aren't just attendants. We belong to something greater. Passengers like him?" He gestured toward Malik's limp body with a cruel flick of his wrist. "They're the reason this system is broken." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers leaned forward, gripping their armrests. Others shrank back into their seats, trying to make sense of what they were hearing. One man cautiously raised his phone to begin recording again, his hands trembling. Thomas's voice broke through the silence, hoarse with disbelief. "You're saying this wasn't just an outburst? You did this to my son on purpose?" Lionel looked at him like a teacher correcting a student. "He was chosen. Not because of who he is, but what he represents. Entitlement, weakness, arrogance disguised as innocence. This plane is ours, not theirs. We don't serve passengers anymore. We manage them." Adrian's mind raced. The signs were all there. Grant's controlled rage, the smirk after violence. And now Lionel, stepping into the light, revealing something far more sinister than he had expected. This wasn't about a single attendant's cruelty. It was organized, cultivated, hidden in plain sight. He stepped forward once more, placing himself squarely between Lionel and the rest of the cabin. "You're speaking like a man who's memorized a manifesto. Adrian said, his voice low but cutting. "I've heard speeches like that before. In war zones, in interrogation rooms." In front of mass graves, Lionel's eyes flickered for the first time, but he recovered quickly. "We have support." "You think you can stop us because you wear a badge in some other world? You're standing in ours now. The Sky Realm doesn't belong to the public anymore. It belongs to us." Behind him, Grant tried to rise, still cradling his injured wrist. His voice was slurred with rage. "You think this ends with us? You think a washed-up soldier can dismantle what we've built?" Thomas's fists clenched at the edge of Malik's seat, but Adrian raised a hand slightly, silently signaling him to hold. "Let them speak," Adrian murmured. "The more they reveal, the less they can deny later." Lionel scoffed. "You're already too late. We're embedded. Pilots, security, even Summit headquarters. Our goal isn't chaos. It's control. People have grown entitled to comfort, to choices. That ends now. You think you've exposed something today? You've only scratched the surface." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just begun. And suddenly, Adrian saw the whole board. This wasn't about personal hatred. It was about ideology. These men had twisted their roles into positions of dominance. They weren't targeting just Malik. Malik was bait, an intentional trigger to provoke a confrontation, to test reactions, to see who would push back and who would stay silent. They wanted to create fear and submit passengers to it, but they didn't plan for someone like Adrian Holt. Adrian's gaze swept across the aisle. Passengers sat stiffly, eyes darting between him and the uniformed men. Most were terrified. A few were silently rising to their feet. One young man, mid-20s, spoke up, voice cracking. "This can't be real. This is some kind of game, right?" "No," Adrian replied, never looking away from Lionel. "This is a hijacking of purpose. Not with weapons, but with belief twisted into poison." Lionel advanced a step, his voice almost pleading. "Why fight it?" "Order must be enforced. Discipline restored. The world has forgotten who deserves authority." Adrian didn't blink. "And you've mistaken cruelty for strength," Grant hissed behind Lionel. "You'll regret getting involved." "You think your badge means anything up here?" Adrian leaned in, the lights of the overhead panel casting hard lines on his jaw. "This isn't about badges. It's about humanity, and you failed that test the moment you touched my nephew." His next words were loud, meant for every ear on that plane. "I will dismantle your whole network, starting right here." There was no threat in his tone, only promise, only precision. The passengers leaned in closer. Lionel's certainty faltered. For the first time he saw not just resistance, but reckoning in Adrian's eyes. And then Adrian took a slow step forward, the cabin frozen in that breath between collapse and consequence. One truth can unravel an entire web of lies. Emergency landing protocol initiated. We will be diverting to Dominion Airfield immediately. Remain seated with seatbelts fastened. The captain's voice cracked through the intercom like a lightning bolt in a stormy sky. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The seatbelt signs blinked urgently overhead, but the chaos inside the cabin was far from contained. Tension had boiled over, and now it threatened to consume the entire aircraft. Lionel stepped into the aisle like a man possessed. His uniform was pristine, but his eyes were wild with desperation and defiance. "He's lying," he shouted, jabbing a trembling finger in Adrian Holt's direction. "That man is a fraud. He's trying to hijack this plane." Several passengers flinched. Others turned to each other with nervous expressions, unsure what to believe. A few clutched their armrests tighter, torn between fear and logic. Adrian didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly reached into his inner coat pocket, his movements deliberate, every muscle controlled. He retrieved a leather case and flipped it open. The golden military insignia glinted under the harsh cabin lights, casting a sharp glimmer across the seats. Silence fell like a curtain. "I am Commander Adrian Holt of the 4th Division," he said firmly, his voice deep and even, honed by years of battlefield discipline. "I am the legal guardian of the child who was just assaulted. And these men," he turned his gaze slowly, deliberately to Grant and Lionel, "attacked him without cause. No one will protect them. Not here. Not now." A murmur swelled across the passengers. Doubts began to evaporate like mist under a rising sun. Several passengers who had been recording lowered their phones briefly, glancing between each other as the weight of Adrian's words settled in. The shift in the cabin was almost physical, uncertainty giving way to clarity, fear turning into collective indignation. Grant, sitting slouched and guarded near the galley, sneered through clenched teeth. His bruised wrist throbbed from Adrian's earlier hold, and he cradled it with a bitter glare. "You think anyone will believe you?" he muttered, just loud enough for Adrian to hear. "You won't live to tell this story." Adrian didn't back away. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to a razor-edged whisper only Grant could hear. "I've told far worse stories to men far more dangerous than you." The third attendant's fingers were only inches from the emergency equipment panel when Adrian moved. Like a trigger snapping, the commander surged forward with a force born not just of instinct, but of hard-earned discipline. His boots thudded against the narrow carpeted aisle, the only sound cutting through the tense hum of descent warnings and whispered passenger fears. In a single, fluid motion, he closed the distance and gripped the man's wrist with an iron grasp. The attendant, tall, pale, with eyes that hadn't blinked once since boarding, froze mid-motion, caught in the act like a snake whose strike had been intercepted mid-air. Adrian twisted the wrist just enough to make the man wince but not scream. The plastic flap of the emergency panel dangled loosely as a red lever beneath it gleamed ominously in the dim overhead lights. Adrian's voice was low but unmistakably commanding. "Step away." Now the attendant hesitated, scanning the passengers who had begun filming, their phones trembling in anxious hands. He glanced toward the front of the plane as if expecting backup, but no one moved to help him. Not this time. Adrian forced him down into the aisle, planting a firm knee against his spine, using minimal yet undeniable pressure. The man groaned, not from pain, but from the realization that the plan had failed. Thomas, sitting nearby with Malik half-conscious beside him, watched the scene unfold with growing dread. His son's breathing was shallow but no longer gasping. His chest rose and fell in soft, uneven patterns. Thomas gripped his hand tightly and whispered, "Stay with me, son. We're almost there." As the third attacker was restrained, the cabin seemed to exhale, briefly. But in that breath, Adrian felt the sting of something deeper. This wasn't a moment of safety. It was exposure. Whatever they had planned, it hadn't ended here. It had only been disrupted. His mind raced through possibilities. Were there more on board? Was this a diversion for something larger? The truth slammed into him just as clearly as the grip on the attendant's wrist. This wasn't about a drink. This wasn't about an unruly passenger or even a grudge. This was designed. Thomas caught Adrian's eye. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. What if this was never about Malik? What if he was just the excuse? Adrian didn't respond immediately. He glanced at Malik, his nephew, still fragile, his young face pale, lips slightly parted as he fought to hold on. Then he looked toward the front of the plane, where Grant and Lionel had once stood, where orders were whispered behind service smiles. He knew tactics. He knew diversion. And now, the pieces aligned with chilling clarity. He nodded slowly, lips pressed into a grim line. They wanted a reaction, Adrian murmured, more to himself than anyone else. They wanted fear. Submission. The boy was the bait. The test. Beside him, a passenger reached over with a phone still recording, eyes wide. Are we safe now?" Adrian didn't answer right away. He studied the cabin, noting how many faces still looked unsure, how many heads still swiveled, waiting for the next threat. A child began to cry softly. An elderly man clutched a rosary, murmuring under his breath. The walls of the plane, once humming with quiet conversation and the low buzz of travel, now vibrated with uncertainty. The pilot's voice crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into Dominion Airfield. Please remain in your seats." The weight of it all settled over Adrian's shoulders like a lead coat. He turned to Thomas, his voice resolute now. This was staged. The attack wasn't the goal, it was the rehearsal. Thomas paled. For what? Adrian scanned the cabin one last time. His senses still flared with warning. There were no more attendants reaching for switches, no more uniforms hiding hostility, but that didn't mean the threat was gone. He lowered his voice, eyes narrowing as he returned to the restrained attendant now lying still on the floor. "We're going to find out." The descent began in earnest. Outside the windows, the landscape of Dominion approached, city lights twinkling like scattered embers on a dark canvas. Inside, silence ruled, punctuated only by the occasional cough, the soft beep of medical equipment, and the ever-present hum of recorded footage capturing history in real time. Adrian didn't move from his spot. His presence alone was the final shield between the passengers and chaos. He gripped the seat edge, his knuckles white, but his eyes clear. He knew this wasn't over. The enemy's first move often reveals the depth of their plan. The wheels screeched against the tarmac as Flight 927 made its emergency landing at Dominion Airfield. A jolt ran through the cabin as the aircraft slowed, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. Outside the windows, red and blue lights pulsed like warning signals from another world. Police cruisers, ambulances, and airport security vehicles had formed a barricade around the runway. The tension inside the cabin, though quieter now, remained sharp and electric. The jet bridge had not yet extended when the main door was forced open by emergency crew. Uniformed officers moved quickly up the aisle, stepping over oxygen tanks, scattered trays, and trembling passengers still clinging to their seats. Adrian Holt stood near the galley, arms folded, his broad frame blocking the path between the authorities and the restrained attendants. His jaw was set, his eyes locked on Grant, who sat slumped against the wall, still clutching his injured wrist. Lionel and the third flight attendant, whose name no one had yet spoken, were kneeling nearby, zip-tied by two passengers who had followed Adrian's commands to the letter. A paramedic team pushed forward toward the middle rows where Thomas Rivers hovered protectively over Malik, whose breathing had stabilized but whose eyes had yet to fully open. One of the medics knelt, pressing fingers gently to the boy's neck, then called over his shoulder, "Pulse strong, shallow breaths. We need to move." Now Thomas stepped back only slightly, allowing the stretcher through, but his grip never left his son's hand. As they wheeled Malik down the aisle, Thomas looked to Adrian, his older brother, his lips parted but trembling. Words didn't come, only a tight nod laced with anguish and gratitude. Adrian returned it, firm and silent. Behind him, the police officers moved in. "Step aside, sir." "We'll take them from here," said one officer, gesturing toward the restrained attendants. Adrian did not hesitate. He stepped aside without a word, allowing the officers to hoist Grant and Lionel to their feet. The third man whimpered, offering no resistance. "I'll make sure you're remembered for this," Grant hissed as one officer tightened the cuffs on his wrists. "You don't know who we answer to." Adrian didn't flinch. "I know enough," he replied coldly, then turned his back on them. As passengers disembarked under the supervision of security, a quiet murmur rose among them. Some nodded to Adrian in passing, others gave hushed thanks. A few simply stared, still trying to process what had unfolded at 30,000 feet. Inside the terminal, the lighting felt harsh after the dim, tense atmosphere of the plane. Echoes of footsteps and clipped radio chatter filled the hall. The air carried the sterile tang of disinfectant and airport coffee, but beneath it was something heavier, an invisible weight of injustice still lingering. Adrian stood near a side wall, his posture calm but alert. His eyes moved with purpose, scanning the faces around him. He was not waiting for congratulations. He was waiting for the real enemy to show their face. It didn't take long. From the far end of the concourse, a man approached, flanked by 2 airport officials. His stride was smooth, calculated. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his black hair slicked neatly back. He moved with the air of someone used to controlling the outcome before the first question was even asked. "General Holt?" the man asked, extending a hand with rehearsed confidence. "Victor Drame. I'm legal counsel for Skyrealm Airlines. I've been fully briefed on the incident." Adrian didn't shake his hand. Victor retracted it smoothly, unfazed. "A terrible misunderstanding, really. Obviously upsetting for everyone involved, but I believe there's a way we can handle this quietly. With dignity, for your family and ours." Adrian's gaze darkened. "You think what happened on that plane was a misunderstanding?" Victor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Passengers panic. Employees make mistakes. If we let the media twist this, it won't serve anyone." "You're already trying to twist it," Adrian said, voice low and steady. "A child was choked unconscious. Your employees formed an organized ring of assault aboard a commercial flight, and you call it a mistake?" Victor's smile thinned. "Let's be reasonable, Commander. The airline takes this seriously, of course, but there are procedures to follow, investigations to complete. The less said now, the better for everyone." Adrian took a step forward. Victor instinctively leaned back, just slightly. "I'm not here to protect your image," Adrian said. "I'm here to protect my family, and every other family who steps onto your planes, unaware that wolves are hiding in uniform." Victor opened his mouth to respond, but Adrian continued, voice firm. "You want silence. I want accountability. We're not on the same side." For the first time, Victor's polished exterior cracked. A flicker of tension passed through his eyes, but he masked it quickly with a shrug. "Then I suppose we'll let the proper authorities sort it out." "We will," Adrian replied. "But understand this. Every second you spend trying to bury this will only make the fallout worse." Victor turned without a word, disappearing into the crowd of officials and blinking screens. Adrian stood alone now, the sounds of the airport returning to normal as the last of the passengers filtered away. He glanced down the corridor toward the medical bay where Thomas had taken Malik. The boy would live. That was what mattered. But Adrian knew this wasn't over. This was never about one child or one flight. He looked around at the officers, the staff, the passengers giving statements, and felt a quiet certainty rising in his chest. There would be more battles ahead, in courtrooms and boardrooms, behind glass doors and sealed files, and he would be ready for every one of them. Sometimes the enemy's shield is made of polished lies. The gavel slammed sharply, silencing the murmurs that buzzed through the packed courtroom. All eyes turned toward the prosecution table, where General Adrian Holt sat upright, face calm but eyes blazing with restrained purpose. He wasn't in uniform, but the air around him carried the weight of authority. The judge, a stern man with a weathered face and gray streaks in his beard, looked over his glasses. "We will now proceed with the testimony of General Adrian Holt," he said. Adrian stood without hesitation, moving to the witness stand with the same discipline he carried into every mission. The courtroom lights seemed harsher than the battlefield. He took the oath, then sat, his hands folded tightly in front of him. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed attorney named Darren Mace, approached with a steady tone. "General Holt," Mace began, "can you describe exactly what you witnessed on Flight 927? Adrian's voice was steady, deep. "Yes. I watched my 14-year-old nephew be violently choked by a flight attendant. I watched passengers frozen in fear, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. And I watched two men in Skyrealm uniforms abuse their position to intimidate and hurt innocent people. Gasps scattered across the room. Victor Drame, Skyrealm's lead attorney, leaned over to whisper something to his assistant, a smug smile twitching at the corners of his lips. Mace continued, "And how did you respond?" "I intervened," Adrian said firmly, not just as his uncle, but as someone who has sworn to protect others, whether on foreign soil or 30,000 feet in the air. Victor Drame stood then, his steps theatrical, his suit crisp. He addressed the jury before even looking at Adrian. "Ladies and gentlemen, we do not question General Holt's military service. But we must ask, was his reaction appropriate, or was it the overreach of a man conditioned for war, not peace?" Adrian's jaw tightened. Victor turned toward him, voice cold. "Is it not true that you forcibly subdued a member of the flight crew? That you physically restrained another? That you demanded control of an aircraft in mid-air?" Adrian's eyes didn't blink. "I acted to stop the assault of a child." Victor nodded, walking slowly. "A child, you claim, was unconscious. Yet there is no official recording of that specific moment, is there?" The words hung heavy. Before Adrian could answer, Mace interjected, "There are videos. Dozens. From passengers. They've been submitted as evidence." "Yes," Victor said, pivoting, "and conveniently shared online to paint the picture you want. But videos can be edited. What cannot be changed is behavior. And General Holt, despite his achievements, is a man trained for combat, not conflict resolution." Adrian didn't flinch. "And you're a man trained to defend corporations, not children." The room stirred, the judge banging the gavel again. "Enough. Proceed with the evidence." The next hour was a blur of video footage. The screens showed Malik gasping for breath, Thomas screaming for help, Adrian stepping forward. The audience watched, some with hands over their mouths. Still, Victor pushed doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in his closing pitch for the day, "sometimes even heroes make mistakes." The session recessed, and Adrian stepped outside the courtroom, greeted by cameras and whispers. His mind spun, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing what they were up against. Skyrealm wasn't just defending a few violent employees, they were protecting a system. Later that night, a soft knock echoed through the prosecution's temporary office. Mace opened the door to find a young man in a wrinkled Skyrealm vest, cap pulled low. "My name's Elias Dorn," he said nervously. "I work cabin crew. I've seen things. I have documents, memos. They knew about Grant and Lionel. They covered it up. I kept copies." Mace's eyes widened. Adrian, who had remained silent in the corner, slowly stood. "Why now?" Adrian asked. Elias hesitated, his voice shaking. "Because it could have been my little brother." Inside the dim office, Elias handed over a sealed folder, dozens of internal memos, supervisor emails referencing flagged staff and contained reports. Adrian flipped through them, his stomach sinking. This wasn't just neglect, it was a pattern, a shield built around abusive behavior, polished to protect the brand. The next morning in court, Mace presented the new evidence. "These documents," he said, holding them high, "prove that Skyrealm Airlines knowingly retained employees with histories of violent conduct. They received warnings. They ignored them. They prioritized image over safety." The courtroom broke into murmurs. Victor Drame stood frozen, color draining from his face. The judge ordered silence as the documents were submitted. Adrian turned to Elias, seated quietly in the back row, and gave him a small nod of thanks. Victor's rebuttal was weak, strained. He attempted to cast doubt on the source, claiming the documents were stolen. But the damage was done. Even the jury's faces had changed. What once was cautious curiosity had turned into visible concern, even anger. The judge called for a recess. Adrian remained seated, steady, but behind his stillness was a storm of thoughts. Elias Dorn had tipped the balance, but it was also a warning. If Skyrealm was willing to protect violent staff, what else had they buried? The crowd filed out slowly, the tension thick in the air. Adrian lingered a moment longer, eyes fixed on the empty witness stand. When shadows break, light floods faster than fear can hide. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the jury foreman stood, the verdict gripped in his trembling hand. All eyes locked on him, some hopeful, some fearful. Adrian Holt sat motionless at the prosecution's table, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. Thomas, seated beside him, held Malik's hand tightly, the boy now healthier, though still marked by the trauma. The judge gave a slight nod. On the charges of aggravated assault, conspiracy to endanger a minor, and criminal endangerment, the foreman began, voice low but steady. We find the defendants, Grant Vaynar and Lionel Miles. Guilty gasps rippled through the courtroom like a gust of wind tearing through dry leaves. The prosecutor exhaled slowly, nodding with restrained satisfaction. Grant, seated with shackles around his wrists, showed no emotion, only a hard, vacant stare aimed at the floor. Lionel, however, flinched, his breathing quickening as the reality of the verdict sank in. The third attendant, whose name had been withheld for safety, kept his gaze lowered, aware that his leniency had come at the price of betraying his former comrades. But the betrayal had saved lives. Thomas's eyes welled with tears as he turned to Adrian, unable to form words. Malik, still weak, leaned his head against his father's shoulder and whispered, "Is it over now?" Adrian looked down at his nephew, forcing a small, calm smile that didn't reach his tired eyes. "For now," he said quietly, his voice thick with weight. The courtroom was filled with the sound of chairs shifting, murmurs, and the heavy thud of the judge's gavel announcing the formal sentencing. 20 years for Grant, 15 for Lionel. The third man's cooperation would reduce his prison time, but he would remain under surveillance indefinitely. Outside the courthouse, a wave of press and supporters surged around the front steps. Cameramen shouted questions, flashbulbs ignited like lightning, and microphones stretched like arms toward Adrian. But he did not speak. He moved with deliberate calm, shielding Thomas and Malik as they made their way to a waiting vehicle. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Malik had insisted on visiting the same room where he had stayed during recovery. He said it made him feel safe. Now, inside that pale green hospital room, with machines humming softly and the scent of disinfectant lingering in the air, Adrian stood alone near the window. Thomas had gone to make a call. Malik had fallen asleep again, curled under a thick blue blanket. His breathing was even, his face peaceful. The boy who had been choked into unconsciousness now looked like any other young teenager catching up on sleep. Adrian's arms were crossed tightly over his chest. His gaze, however, was far away, not on the skyline beyond the window, but on the courtroom, on the flash of Victor Drame's face when the whistleblower had revealed the internal documents. Skyrealm's polished armor had shattered that day. The company's lies, its hidden tolerance of cruelty disguised as discipline, had been dragged into the light. The public fallout was already underway. Stockholders were in an uproar. Several executives were resigning, and Drame, once so smug, had walked out of the courtroom with a shell-shocked expression, knowing his reputation was in ruins. But for Adrian, none of it felt like triumph. Victory, perhaps, but not peace. The soft knock on the door pulled him back. A young man in uniform entered and saluted smartly. "General Holt," he said, keeping his voice low, "the secretary has signed the authorization. You've been appointed to lead the Civil Aviation Safety Task Force. Orders will arrive by morning." Adrian gave a faint nod. "Understood." As the young officer left, Adrian turned back toward the hospital bed. He stepped closer, watching Malik sleep. A moment passed in silence. He crouched beside the bed, resting his forearm gently on the frame. His voice was quiet, but unwavering. "You were strong when it mattered most," he whispered, "but this won't stop here. There's more buried beneath all this. More passengers. More silence. I'll find them. I'll make sure no child, no family, ever has to face what you did." Malik stirred lightly but didn't wake. Adrian remained beside him, unmoving, a soldier still in the middle of battle. Only now, the battlefield was policy, not war zones. And then, as if reaffirming a promise made in fire, he leaned in slightly, his voice resolute, grounded in everything he had endured. "Justice is not the end of the fight. It is only the beginning." He thought he was untouchable until the army commander stood up. Seconds later, the tables turned. If you stand for dignity, justice, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racism, abuse of power, and the sudden reversal of authority when hidden strength is revealed. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, justice, and accountability in the face of discrimination and oppression.